It was a regular morning at the town's local bank. The air was filled with the faint hum of murmured conversations, the soft tapping of keyboards, and the occasional sighs of impatient customers shifting in line. Among them, an elderly man slowly made his way through the entrance. He wasn't in a rush, nor did he seem bothered by the long queue ahead. His worn military jacket, neatly pressed despite its age, clung to his thin frame. His posture, though slightly stooped, still held a quiet dignity. Deep lines marked his face, each one telling a story of battles fought, years lived, and sacrifices made. The bank was busy. Employees shuffled paperwork, customers checked their phones, and the tellers worked with varying degrees of enthusiasm. No one seemed to notice the old man at first, except for a few curious glances. He moved at his own pace, his polished black cane tapping lightly against the tiled floor. At the front counter, a young teller named Jake sighed audibly as he glanced at the growing line. He was in his early 20s, impatient, and clearly irritated by anything that slowed down his workflow. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened just enough to push the boundaries of professionalism. As the veteran approached the counter, Jake barely looked up, already showing signs of annoyance. He had seen customers like this before, old folks who took forever, fumbling with their wallets, asking too many questions. He was sure this would be another waste of time. The old man stopped in front of the counter, adjusting his jacket slightly. His hands were weathered, veins prominent beneath the skin. "Good morning, young man," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to make an inquiry about my account." Jake let out a small, barely concealed sigh. He didn't even try to hide the impatience in his voice as he responded, Yeah, ID and account number?" The old man reached into his pocket, moving carefully, but before he could pull out his documents, Jake rolled his eyes. "Look, sir," he interrupted, tapping his pen against the desk. "If you don't have your stuff ready, maybe step aside and let someone else go first." A few heads turned in the bank. Some customers raised their eyebrows at Jake's tone, but no one said anything. The veteran paused for a moment, meeting Jake's gaze. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes. Something deep, something unreadable. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded. "Very well," he murmured, stepping aside. But there was something about the way he did it, something that sent a small shiver down the spine of those who were paying attention. This wasn't over. The veteran stepped aside, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in his posture. He wasn't defeated, just patient. Jake, on the other hand, smirked slightly and turned his attention to the next customer, acting as if nothing had happened. He processed transactions quickly, barely making eye contact, eager to move the line along. Minutes passed. The veteran waited near the side, standing still, observing. When the line had thinned, he approached the counter again. This time his documents were already in his hand, neatly stacked. He placed them down gently in front of Jake. "I believe everything you need is here," he said, his voice calm. Jake barely glanced at the papers before letting out an exaggerated sigh. "All right, let's see what we've got." He flipped through the documents carelessly, drumming his fingers against the desk. The veteran watched him, unblinking, his weathered hands resting on the counter. A few customers nearby had started paying attention now. Something about the interaction felt wrong. Jake scoffed as he typed in the details. "You're here about a pension issue, huh?" he said, sounding unimpressed. "Yeah, these systems are slow, so don't expect a miracle today." The veteran didn't react. He simply waited. Jake continued typing, but his irritation grew. "Man, I don't get why people don't just handle this stuff online," he muttered under his breath. "Yeah, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's like some folks just enjoy making life harder." A woman standing behind the veteran shifted uncomfortably. A man in a business suit frowned. Even the security guard by the entrance seemed to straighten up slightly. Jake let out another sigh. "All right, looks like your file has some outdated information. You'll have to come back another day after filling out some paperwork." The veteran didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Jake's face. "That can't be right," he said evenly. "Everything should be in order. Perhaps you should check again." Jake rolled his eyes and tapped a few more keys. Then, without even pretending to look closely, he shook his head. "Nope, same thing. Outdated records." The veteran tilted his head slightly. "Are you certain?" Jake scoffed. Look, old man, I do this all day. I think I know how to read a system error. The room fell uncomfortably silent. A few gasps could be heard from the people nearby. Even some of the other tellers looked up from their work. The veteran's expression didn't change. He didn't seem angry, but there was something powerful in the way he stood. Then, quietly, he said 4 words that sent a ripple through the room. I'd like a manager. Jake smirked, leaning back in his chair. Yeah? Good luck with that? A few customers exchanged glances. They could feel it. Something was about to happen. The veteran didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out an old flip phone, and made a call. His voice remained calm as he spoke. It's me, I need a favor. Then he hung up. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, come on, who are you even calling? The veteran didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside once more. And then, just minutes later, a black car pulled up outside the bank. And everything changed. The sleek black car rolled to a stop right in front of the bank's glass doors. Its polished surface reflected the morning sun, making it gleam with an air of quiet authority. Customers near the windows turned to look. Even the security guard instinctively adjusted his stance. Something about that car, its presence, its timing, made it clear that whoever was inside was not just another customer. The doors swung open, and a man stepped out. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of power without needing to say a word. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but his eyes scanned the room with sharp precision. The bank fell silent. Jake, still seated at his station, glanced up, and for the first time that morning, his smirk faltered. The man walked in with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He didn't look around. He didn't ask for directions. He went straight to the veteran. And then, in a moment that made Jake's breath catch in his throat, the well-dressed man extended his hand. Sir, he said with unmistakable respect, I came as soon as I got your call. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the back clutched her purse tighter. A young man who had been scrolling through his phone put it down, suddenly alert. Jake stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The veteran, still composed, shook the man's hand firmly. Thank you for coming, he said simply. The bank's manager, a short, nervous-looking man who had been in his office, came rushing forward, his face pale. He recognized the man in the suit immediately. Mr. Caldwell, the manager stammered. We weren't expecting you today. The well-dressed man, Mr. Caldwell, didn't acknowledge him. His gaze had already shifted. To Jake. Jake swallowed hard. Caldwell's voice was calm but carried weight. I assume this is the employee who treated you disrespectfully? The veteran didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Jake, holding his gaze. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just quiet, piercing observation. Jake felt something heavy settle in his stomach. His fingers twitched slightly against the desk. The silence stretched. Then, in a voice softer than before, but somehow even more powerful, the veteran finally spoke. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, he said. One that needs to be corrected. The entire bank seemed to hold its breath. And Jake realized, far too late, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jake could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. His usual cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a nervous stiffness in his shoulders. Mr. Caldwell, the man who had arrived in the black car, turned to the bank manager, his expression unreadable. I assume you know who this man is? He asked, gesturing toward the veteran. The manager swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the veteran and Caldwell. I believe so, he stammered, but I didn't realize. You didn't realize because you never bothered to ask, Caldwell interrupted sharply. His gaze snapped back to Jake, and neither did he. Jake felt his throat go dry. Look, I didn't. You didn't what? Caldwell cut him off. Didn't think it was important to treat customers with basic respect? Didn't think an elderly man deserved your patience? Jake opened his mouth, then shut it. His face burned with humiliation. Caldwell exhaled slowly, then turned back to the veteran. Sir, please allow me to apologize on behalf of this bank. The veteran nodded but remained silent. His presence alone commanded attention. Then, Caldwell spoke again, and his next words sent another ripple through the room. This man, he said, looking around so that everyone could hear, is Colonel James Harland. A decorated war hero. A man who not only served his country, but has spent the last 30 years dedicating his time and resources to helping veterans, military families, and community programs. Gasps echoed throughout the bank. A woman near the back covered her mouth in shock. The security guard visibly straightened, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to deep respect. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Caldwell continued, his voice even but firm. Colonel Harland is the reason many banks, including this one, have military pension programs at all. He's worked behind the scenes to make sure veterans receive the respect and care they deserve. He turned to Jake once more, his expression cold. And you had the audacity to dismiss him like he was nothing. Jake had no words, no excuses, nothing. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a mountain. But the veteran, Colonel Harland, simply stood there, composed, watching Jake with an expression impossible to read. And then, at last, he spoke. "Respect," he said quietly, "is not something you give only to those you think are important." His words hung heavy in the air. Jake lowered his gaze, shame twisting in his chest. But this wasn't over yet. Because the next thing Caldwell said would change everything. A tense silence filled the bank. All eyes were on Colonel Harland and Jake, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Jake could barely breathe. He wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. He had disrespected not just an elderly customer, but a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. Caldwell exhaled, his tone controlled but firm. Colonel Harland doesn't just advocate for veterans. He has personally funded programs that have helped countless military families. He's responsible for financial initiatives that have supported banks like this one. The very system you use, Jake, was influenced by this man's efforts. A murmur ran through the crowd. Employees exchanged uneasy glances. The realization of who they had in their presence hit like a shockwave. Jake swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Harlan tilted his head slightly. His expression remained calm, but there was something sharp in his gaze. "No, you didn't," he agreed. "And yet, would it have changed how you treated me?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by the question. Harlan continued, his voice steady. "Would you have been more patient if you had known my name? If you had known my history? Or do you only offer kindness to those you think deserve it?" The words hit like a slap. Jake looked away, shame tightening in his chest. The colonel didn't sound angry. He wasn't raising his voice. And yet, his calmness made the lesson sting even more. A woman in line dabbed at her eyes. Even the security guard, a younger man, looked visibly moved. Harland let out a slow breath. Respect isn't about rank. It isn't about wealth or status. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and treating them with dignity. Jake's jaw clenched. He had spent years acting like he knew everything, brushing off customers, rolling his eyes at their slow ways. But now, standing in front of a man who had done more in his lifetime than Jake could even comprehend, he felt small. His throat tightened, his palms were sweaty. He had to say something. His voice cracked. He took a shaky breath and finally forced the words out. "I'm sorry." For the first time that day, he looked Harlan directly in the eyes, not with arrogance, but with genuine remorse. The colonel studied him for a long moment. The weight of his gaze made Jake's hands tremble. And then, slowly, Harlan nodded. "I accept your apology," he said simply. Jake's shoulders sagged, relief and shame crashing into him at the same time. But he wasn't off the hook yet. Because Caldwell wasn't finished, Jake barely had time to process the colonel's words before Caldwell spoke again. "An apology is a start," he said, his tone sharp, "but actions have consequences." Jake's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming. Caldwell turned to the bank manager, who had been standing frozen, unsure of what to do. "How long has he worked here?" The manager hesitated. "A little over a year." Caldwell nodded. Then he should know better. He looked directly at Jake. "Disrespecting customers, especially veterans, is unacceptable. You've made it clear that you don't value the people who come through these doors." Jake swallowed hard. "I do. Caldwell raised a hand, silencing him. "No, you don't get to talk your way out of this. You had a choice in how you treated this man. You chose impatience, you chose arrogance, and today you face the consequences of those choices." Jake felt his heart pound. Are you firing me?" The bank manager shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Caldwell exhaled slowly. "Not yet." Jake blinked, confused. What? Caldwell crossed his arms. Colonel Harlan believes in second chances, and despite your disrespect, he accepted your apology. So here's what's gonna happen. Jake braced himself. You will undergo mandatory customer service training. Real training, not just some online module you can click through. You will also personally assist veterans who visit this branch for the next 3 months. You will learn their names. You will listen to their stories. You will serve them with the respect they deserve. Jake felt his face burn. He had never been held accountable like this before. And, Caldwell added, his gaze sharp, if I hear even one complaint about your attitude, you will be terminated immediately. The words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a lesson. A second chance, but one he would have to earn. He glanced at Colonel Harlan, expecting him to look smug, maybe satisfied at seeing him put in his place. But the veteran's expression was calm, steady, almost understanding. Jake took a shaky breath. I understand. Caldwell nodded. Good. Then turning back to Harlan, he said, Sir, is this acceptable to you? Harlan studied Jake for a moment before answering. People can change, he said simply, but only if they choose to. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake knew he had a choice to make, and this time, he wouldn't take it for granted. The tension in the bank slowly began to settle, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. Jake stood there, processing everything. His humiliation, his regret, and the unexpected second chance he had been given. He could have been fired on the spot. But instead, Colonel Harlan had chosen to teach him something far more valuable. The veteran gave him one last measured look before picking up his documents from the counter. He nodded slightly. I'll be back next week, he said calmly. I hope to see some progress by then. Jake swallowed hard and gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Harlan turned and walked toward the exit, his cane tapping against the floor. Mr. Caldwell followed closely behind, but before stepping out, he paused and threw Jake one final warning glance. Don't waste this opportunity. Jake nodded again, feeling the gravity of those words settle deep in his chest. As the black car pulled away, the bank slowly returned to normal. People resumed their transactions, but there was still a sense that something important had just taken place. A few customers gave Jake lingering looks, some with disappointment, others with curiosity. And then, something unexpected happened. An older woman stepped forward in the line. She had been watching everything from the beginning. Instead of handing over her documents right away, she looked Jake straight in the eye. Do you know what my husband used to say? She asked softly. Jake hesitated, caught off guard. What? She smiled gently. Respect is given freely, not because someone has earned it, but because you have the integrity to offer it. Jake felt his throat tighten. He nodded, unable to speak. Then, slowly, he straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and forced himself to look her in the eye. Not with impatience, not with frustration, but with sincerity. How can I help you today, ma'am? The woman's smile widened. For the first time since he had started this job, Jake truly understood the meaning of those words, and from that moment on, he would never forget them. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us bring more meaningful content to you. What did you think about Colonel Harlan's lesson? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share this story with your friends and family to remind everyone about the power of kindness and respect. And remember, respect isn't given based on status. It's a reflection of your own character. See you in the next story.